Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone around the globe that's watching this. My name is Joshua Zabel. I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Minitab. There's a lot of noise about tariffs in the news, and given my position, a lot of people ask me either to explain them or for ideas on how to deal with the consequences or potential implications of them. I wanted to take a few minutes and talk about tariffs, not in a political way, in an economic way, and also provide some ideas specifically for manufacturers on how you can address some uncertainty related to tariffs and frankly take some costs out without really impacting your business in a negative way. So let's start the presentation. Tariffs, bottlenecks, and better decision making for manufacturers. Like I said, I want to show you tangible, proven ways you can address uncertainty in a manufacturing operation and frankly reduce costs without negative impacts. Everything I'll suggest to you actually has positive impacts for your business. And frankly, there are things you could be doing regardless of the outcome of tariffs. So let me talk a little bit about myself for a second. I've got a bachelor's and a master's in economics, so it makes me a little bit know a little bit about tariffs, enough to be dangerous. If you're an executive, whether you're in operations, frankly, human resources, quality, continuous improvement, frankly, most people around the globe these days are reading so much on tariffs. I'm hopeful this will help you. I want to be clear that this does not reflect any political views. There's no political slant here. This is all about some economic theory around tariffs, and frankly, ways to address uncertainty related to them. As I said, I'm the CFO at Minitab. I've also worked on Wall Street. I've worked on Main Street. So I think I've got a lot of different experiences around manufacturing. And I'm going to show you how you can reduce what I call hidden costs out there in a very positive way that benefits your organization. So let's just start with why tariffs and what is the impact of them. Why would somebody want to impose tariffs? Well, put simply, a government that is imposing tariffs is aiming to protect domestic industries from foreign competition, and frankly, raise revenue for the government. The way the theory goes is if you artificially raise the price of imports, it makes domestically produced things more attractive. That in turn could cause an increase in demand for domestic produced goods, which means more jobs for people in that country. More jobs means less reliance on other economies as well, etc. The government benefits as well because if you have more jobs, excuse me, you're paying less in unemployment. If you have more jobs, more people are paying taxes on their wages. And frankly, if you have domestic corporations that are producing more and selling more, those corporations pay more taxes as well. So in theory, a country would introduce these type of things to benefit both the government and domestic industry. So if tariffs have these positive benefits for the country that's imposing it, why is there such concern about the uncertainty related to these tariffs, particularly in the United States? And put simply, from a US perspective, if you're sitting in the US, for tariffs to work, really long-term investments need to be made to create these jobs and to increase production of these goods. Unless there are really 100% made in the USA alternatives that already exist, in general, you're going to have to change the dynamics of that economy. In the times of monarchies, when a king would rule for 50 years, you can obviously make these type of investments and see them potentially pay off. But in a time where you have presidencies that last 4 years, and in particular, we know this president is in his second term. The question becomes, do you make these investments? Because in 4 years, when the White House turns over, regardless of who becomes the president, do these tariffs stick? So in practical terms, do you want to start building a factory unless you know that you can finish it in the 4 years and get the benefit on the return on that factory? And that's really difficult to predict and to see the future. So it leaves people in a paralyzed position as to what to do. What the fear is that if you start raising the current goods that have foreign produced items or parts in it, That obviously can impact the consumer by making things more expensive, which in turn could hurt demand and ultimately could hurt the economy. So there's pros and cons, as you can see. From an international perspective, if you are an exporter to the US, the concern would be that your goods are becoming artificially more expensive in the US, and that could impact your demand. Impact a lower demand means lower sales, which ultimately could impact your economy. So, despite the tariffs having positive potential implications in theory, in practice, it's very hard as a manufacturer today to strategize appropriately around what to do and how to deal with them. There's really only way to deal with them in the short term, and that effectively is cutting costs. Put simply, if you kind of think about a company's profits being a function of sales minus costs, if the costs of their goods go up because they're importing things that now become artificially more expensive, their profits go down, which means either you have to increase the price or the volume, that's how you get your sales numbers higher, or decrease the costs. Many organizations try to pass through these tariffs by increasing prices. And again, in theory, that works, except as prices go up, that can have an impact on your demand. And so, again, there's a balance here of ultimately the only thing that you can really do without having an impact is reduce the costs of your goods that you're producing. If you're outside the US, you're thinking of exporting to the US, you have a similar quandary. Again, your prices have now gone up, which means the demand for your goods could potentially go down. So, in order to offset the price and or offer a lower price, or the same price that they could buy it at prior to a tariff, you effectively have to reduce your costs as well. So by reducing your costs, you can make it cheaper, you can save your margin, and you can even sell it to the US even with a tariff and have no implications. So if everybody across the globe is getting a mandate about reducing costs, what we hear and read a lot is something is a buzzword, control the controllables. We understand that we're not the president. We understand that we can't tell the future. We don't know how things will ultimately shake out. So control the things you can control, which often results in some knee-jerk cost reduction activities. The thing is, the way you reduce costs have implications. You can kind of see the cartoon here is that, if you keep cutting, you're left with nothing. And so there's an element here of how do you cut costs without impacting the long-term health of the business. So a pretty common way people reduce costs, or common ways people reduce costs, is they lay people off. I think the good news here is, given the great pandemic, the swing we saw in the amount of layoffs and then the level of rehiring that was required after significant layoffs, I think corporations and organizations, frankly, are much more rational about how they think of layoffs, especially given that they've learned certain lessons along that. You can eliminate long-term investments. There's a project. It's got you believe it will have a good return on investment. That return won't come due in a short period of time. You might pause that project, or frankly eliminate it. You could reduce things like spend, selling, marketing, traveling expenses. Now, I put discretionary in quotes because ultimately these things aren't discretionary. Selling is better getting in front of a customer. There's a reason people spend money on marketing. These things all benefit your organization. So ultimately, assuming you are rational and responsible with your budgeting to start, cutting these things have negative implications. And finally, you can delay hiring or making investments, as I said. So you're not necessarily cutting something, but you are delaying doing something, particularly bringing in people or staff. That can have implications both in terms of obviously we're planning them to bring in to do something. That's not getting done. But equally importantly, the stress on your organization can also negatively impact your results. So while all of these have some merits to them, that's the reason why they stuck around and people look to them. They all have potential unintended consequences. So where do people turn next in the control of the controllables? They want to take the cost out of the product. If you're manufacturing something, you look at a product and you say, how do we take cost out of that thing? And again, they're sort of knee-jerk, short-term, go-to plays that people do. People look to squeeze suppliers. Maybe they order in bulk and get better pricing because of the volume. The other thing they may do is eliminate unnecessary parts of the product. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. The problem with these things is they are short term. You can only squeeze your suppliers so much. At some point, you're taking margin out of them, and it's not worth doing business with you. Same thing with buying in bulk. It's one thing to buy in bulk ahead of time, but there's inventory costs as well. And things could go bad with warranties. So you really don't have this as a long-term solution. There are long-term solutions to take costs out of the product, and that is related to substituting materials that are either that could be more cost effective in there. We see that a lot with recycled materials, which I'll talk about. But regardless, that's a long-term strategy, and frankly, something you should be taking a look at anyway, regardless of the tariff picture out there. I talk about the short-term ramifications because I kind of joke around when you take something off of a product at some point, again, you might not have anything left, or you might be missing the feature that you need to differentiate yourself. So once again, taking the cost out of the product can have real ramifications to selling the product. Today, there's an opportunity, given the uncertainty, to simulate things, to look at your supply chain before you make those short-term decisions and use discrete event simulation specifically, or Simulate, which is a Minitab product, to do this and look at your different suppliers and look at the different ways in which you can have options of how to work with your supply chain. I'm not going to get into this specifically. You can see a blog I'm alluding to here on the slide, but it's a very real and practical way of sitting there and going through what if scenarios on your supply chain and things to do before you actually make a knee-jerk reaction. From a long-term replacement, that's a viable option too. Design for reliability is a very common used process or method to substitute materials to make sure that they perform just as well. But they could be cheaper, or like I said, they could improve the quality, or frankly, they could help you from an ESG standpoint. Regardless of what your goal is here, that's a good practice to look at. It'll help you with your long-term planning. And there's nothing wrong with taking long-term costs out anyway. The only problem with this strategy is it takes a long time. To substitute a product for another one, you actually have to make sure it's designed, you have to test it. It's not something simple that you can look at immediately, although it is something that you can do, and I recommend taking a look at. Here's an example of a company that actually had to incorporate recycled materials into their production, and they were able to do it. There's a case study on our website. There's also a video. I encourage you to watch it, of a real practical example of how somebody actually replaced something and substituted a good for a different one, which ultimately saved them costs and helped them switch to a recycled material. By the way, given different SEC requirements, many of the public companies out there and even some of the private ones will be required to evaluate their supply chain anyway. So when you think about simulation and design for reliability, these are two areas that as a manufacturer, you should be looking at. If you're leading an operation, you should be talking to your team about, are we doing these things to plan for the long term anyway, and to plan for different changes? So those are two practical ways to protect yourself or future-proof your business in terms of whether tariffs impact you or not. These are things you can do to help reduce costs and take costs out of the product, and help understand some of the implications of the decisions you're making on your supply chain. But now I want you to just change your mindset a little bit and think about taking the cost out of the product, not so much about taking it out of the product itself, but out of the process that makes the product. And for those of you out there that may not be in a manufacturing industry, this applies to you as well. In general, we don't think of process as having costs to it. And what you want to really think about is process has implication. It has time, it has money implications. If you can improve the efficiency of a process, you are effectively taking cost out of the business. And all you're doing is making your operation more efficient, which really has no adverse effects to the business. So all things being equal, taking costs out of your process does nothing but help you. And so it's something that you should be looking at given this environment today, but frankly, any environment, and it's a mindset to think about. Now let's talk about what that really means. If you're manufacturing something, you want to take cost out of the process. What it means is you're manufacturing more efficiently, said in a different way, you're eliminating scrap or rework. Scrap that gets thrown away is raw materials that you purchased that are now being thrown away. That's real dollars in your margin that's going to the garbage. If you can also improve the throughput per your line, per your operation, per your shift, by definition, you're getting more savings per unit. And so that also helps you save money and improve your margin. Over the course of a long term, as consumers, we all know the higher the quality, the higher the customer satisfaction. If you buy something and it's defective, you're pretty unhappy, and that does something to your brand. I want to highlight that there's something called the rule of 10, which illustrates that the cost to fix something increases tenfold at each subsequent stage of production. So the earlier you catch something, the better the savings. And I'll repeat that later and sort of highlight that. So how do you do that? How do you become a more efficient process? So the first thing you do is you want to measure whether your stuff, your manufactured goods, are in spec or not. And you got to measure them automatically and electronically. Many of you out there are using pencil and paper, which frankly takes longer to do, which means your product gets shipped late. It also can lead to mistakes. I know many people make fun of my handwriting. I don't know if your operators and your testers have great handwriting, but there are many errors that are made, human errors. But at the end of the day, you have to understand, is my product in spec or not? Because if it's not, the sooner you catch that, the quicker you can react to the fact that you have a problem. And so if you're on a manufacturing line and you're manufacturing something and all of a sudden you measure two devices or you measure two widgets and the widgets are out of spec, you know you probably have a problem, and it's time to maybe call timeout, call supervisor on the line, look at what's going on and understand before you continue to make scrap and waste money. So that's the first thing, the simplest thing you should be doing is your stuff in spec or out of spec? Are you automatically testing it to make sure, or automatically measuring it to make sure that you are finding out immediately as soon as possible that the samples you're taking are in spec? The other beauty of doing it automatically with ProLink software is that you actually can see when things are trending in the wrong direction. So while it's important, obviously, to know if it's out of spec, there are many times where things are in spec because specification may have large limits that is going in the wrong direction. What you can do when you have software automatically measuring things, you can actually learn that you're not just in spec, but you're going in the wrong direction, which again enables you to act quickly ahead of having something produced out of spec and adjust accordingly. Now you can look at obviously the product in spec and you can look at your entire lines. And so the key here is if you don't have visibility automatically as to what you're producing, you're going to be missing out on things that are going bad. And if you're missing out on things that are going bad, by definition, you're creating scrap or rework, which is costing you money. The beauty of this is, assuming you implement software and can catch all of these items, it means that you are actually saving money because you're eliminating that. So that's the first and most simple thing that you should be doing if you're on a machine shop or manufacturing floor, to understand, is everything okay? And if everything's okay, that's great. You feel good, but the question is, are you still maximizing or optimizing your process to take the most costs out? And the answer is you're not. Because while the automatic measuring tells you where you are today, it doesn't really match your process and what's happening with your process. And knowing where your process is so critical, because it's really about what will happen tomorrow. So if you think about it simply, today I go to my manufacturing line, my machine shop, my factory, and I'm producing a widget. That widget is either in spec or out of spec. If it's in spec and everything's in spec, great. I believe I've been as efficient as possible. But the truth is, I might not be as efficient as possible. And tomorrow I might wake up and measure things and see things out of spec. And now I'm back to the problem where I've created waste and created costs. So you not only should be measuring your results, if you will, of what you're producing, but you need to be measuring the process of which you're producing things so you can understand that you're not going to have a problem tomorrow or the next day or next week. How do you do that? You monitor your process. You monitor your process with statistical process control. You can see here different tools within statistical process control charts, capability analyses. These are things that many manufacturers are not doing today and should be doing. It's not just about being in spec, it's about being in process spec and making sure your process is capable, your process is stable, to make sure that your process is future proof so that you're not just protecting yourself from costs today, you're protecting yourself from waking up and having unforeseen costs tomorrow. Now, that's great to measure it and measure your process, but you can also do it in real time. There's part of this where you want to measure your results. Here's the widget I produce. Is it in spec and out of spec? But you also want to measure your process in real time so you know your process is out of spec, if you will, to make the change before you produce something that is actually, or a widget that is out of spec. Again, think about cost savings here. If you can optimize your process, you will continue to produce at maximum efficiency. If you produce at maximum efficiency, you will save money. How do you save money? Well, your throughput goes up. Well, how does that mean a savings? You get savings if your throughput goes up. Well, it's really simple math. If you kind of look at how much it costs to make something, and you're making it over the fixed costs, and some of it is fixed costs, some of it is labor costs, some of it is going to be variable costs. Effectively, the more you produce, the lower the cost per unit is. So if you can increase your production over a similar cost structure, you're actually reducing the cost or improving the margin. That's real cost savings or real profitability improvements. So that's critical to reducing scrap, is improving your productivity. The other thing that could be hampering your productivity is bottlenecks. Now, bottlenecks are basically steps in your process that are limiting your throughput. So it's not necessarily that something is wrong with the process, it's just as not as efficient as it possibly could be. Again, hidden costs there. So what you really want to be doing is using discrete event simulation to model out your process where you believe you might have a bottleneck. And so if you kind of think about this as a manufacturer, you want to be measuring the things you produce to make sure that you're not producing waste. You want to be monitoring your process, preferably in real time, to understand that your process is effectively in specification or your process is efficient. But then you also want to use the human element of looking and saying, I think this could be faster. And then without messing around with your process or taking on risks by changing your process, you can use simulation and run what if scenarios to simulate what if I change this element of the process? Would that actually improve my throughput? And all three of those ways will help you increase efficiency and thereby reduce costs. Now, again, how does discrete event help you eliminate the bottlenecks? Well, it gives you a visual process model, it lets you run experiments, you can monitor your resources, so your utilization for every resource, including people, and then you can look at things like wait times and work in progress. So these are all things that give you ideas on how to address quote unquote inefficiency in your process without impacting the quality, without impacting anything about your organization or the future goals of the organization, simply by focusing on how things are made and making sure that you are efficient as possible. That will reduce costs and help you. This can have a dramatic impact. Here's an example where a company increased production output by 50%. That could increase profitability by 50%. So it's a significant amount. So we have real case studies of ways you can reduce bottlenecks. We have real case studies about improving your efficiency using a process control or statistical process control, as well as from a ProLink standpoint, measuring your output to make sure that you have things in spec or out of spec. That you can do the return on there right there. Think about how much it will cost you per defect, and what kind of return you would get by eliminating 1 or 10 or 100. So I think the key takeaway here is, frankly, regardless of what happens with tariffs, improving your process can have a significant impact on your top and bottom line. Given the uncertainty around tariffs, many people, as I said, are paralyzed what to do. They don't want to make a bad decision that has a negative impact on the business. The good news is if you attack your process, you will not be making a bad decision about the business. You'll be making the business healthier. And should you need to actually have those cost reductions, you're already in process, pun intended, of reducing those costs versus being reactive and having to really cut some things that will benefit the long term of your business. And remember, the high cost of poor quality, 15 to 20% of revenue is lost based on poor quality. So these type of process improvements can have a significant impact on your bottom line. These are not incremental changes. These are real costs that can improve your margin in a significant way. And so when we think about hidden costs, we often think of hidden costs or process costs as not material. Okay, we'd love to be efficient, but how does that really translate? Well, I'm telling you that doing these things can translate to the element of 15 to 20% of your revenue. And that's from the ASQ, American Society for Quality. So really doing these actions have a material impact. And again, only positive for the business, for your reputation, and for your customers. I want to thank you all for your time. I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me, and hopefully you found one or two or maybe a few ideas here that you can take back to your organization and improve and help be part of the solution, regardless of what happens with tariffs, of making your organization more efficient, more profitable, and better quality. If you have questions, please leave them with the chat and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Thank you very much.